welcome to our first in live event tonight here at the University of Michigan, at Center for Russian East European Studies. And I'm very excited to present. My name is Mikhail Krutikov. I teach in the Slavic department here, and I'm very excited to present our two speakers who will discuss the film that we have just watched, and I hope you could also watch it, Oratorio Prague. And our speakers tonight are Professor Anya Eisman, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, and she is also a Michigan Society Fellow. Her work is on anarchism, on the history of radical movements and radical politics in Russia and also in other countries from the 19th century until today. And also she works on contemporary Russian theater. And she will be speaking to Professor Jindřich Tolman, who is has been here at the University of Michigan since 1987. Not 1890, yes. And he comes from Prague. He's a linguist. He has written on the history of linguistic theories. He is also an art historian who wrote and curated exhibitions on Czech avant-garde. And he also just finishing a book on the history of Jews in Bohemia in the 19th century. But tonight he will be telling us in a conversation with Anya Eisman about his experience, about his memories of Prague in 1968.
Okay. You want to start?
Yeah, why don't I start with some questions? Okay, I think my mic is working. So Jindra, I want to ask you most of all about your personal experience, but maybe before we go into that, for students watching and maybe those who aren't so familiar with this moment in history, could you just tell us what is the Prague Spring? What led up to it, and what does it actually mean, so that we have some context for the film we watched and for this conversation we'll have about your experience?
Well, that would be a long story, starting many years before 1968. It was basically, there was a process called democratization, revival of democratic principles. The party decided, for reasons we can talk about, to reform itself and so on and so on. That continued a few years before 68. In German, it was then in East German, that is, in the GDR, they invented a term for it that was called the schleichende Revolution, Kontrarevolution, not counter-revolution. So it was what would be the English term, the seeping or counter-revolution. The process reached a certain dynamism and a certain critical stage, and attracted attention by basically all East European countries, including the Soviet Union. So there was a series of various negotiations. Some of them are mentioned in this film, for instance, Bratislava Černá, and before that there were other negotiations. And everything came basically to a head, and by August 28, Moscow, Brezhnev decided, after certain hesitations, to invade by military means. So the scenes that you have seen are the invasions happened on August 21st, actually started already at night before. And the scenes you have seen in the second part of the film are kind of documentary scenes of the invasion. Prague was basically flooded with tanks, various military vehicles, and soldiers. There was not much violence in that sense that we have seen, for instance, in Hungary in 1956. Still, there were casualties, no doubt about it. The estimate is like 150 people in those days. As a footnote, a recent member of the current Communist Party, we still have that Communist Party, said that this was a relatively small number, and that most of these casualties were traffic accidents. He did not say that traffic accidents came about by driving tanks on streets and so on. So we have cases like that. So that is the immediate context. It's a termination in a similar way as, and in some sense, of course, different ways that occurred as a result of these so-called reforms. I'm calling them so-called reforms. And so you have seen a few shots there from these first days. You know, we have a very good title for all this, documenting Prague Spring. And so one of the questions is whether this is a documentary, what kind of documentary, at what point does it begin or stop being a documentary? There are definitely two different parts of this entire film. The first part, I wonder who it was made for, who the audience is, who is the author of the script, of the text that is read there. For my taste, there's a lot of cliches. Surprisingly, because Němec at that time was already an excellent and kind of, it was an idol of filmmaking at that time. He had his, for instance, Diamonds of the Night, an iconic film of the Czech New Wave. So he was a genius on that count. Whether he was a genius on making a documentary, I leave it to specialists. The first thing that shocks me is that an American is saying there about Dubček and so on. So the documentary introduces the basic myth about this time, that Dubček was a great leader and that people liked him, and that everything was kind of he, in my opinion, at that time, and many people saw it that way, he was, you know, Dubček came into power or into his position as a compromise candidate when the old Secretary General was deposed, and the Politburo could not agree on any reasonable candidate. So they elected Dubček because nobody had anything on hand against him, and that meant also that he would be a temporary candidate until the point when one of the wings or factions would kind of take over. Dubček was a nice man. Everyone says that. He liked to be among people, it was generally said. And there is one outrageous scene there that you probably did not realize was outrageous. That's the moment when the reporter sticks the microphone into his car. It was something unheard of. It was something that is a kind of emblematic of the situation, that a reporter could come to the car and the bodyguards would not pull out their guns. And Dubček kind of smiles and says, let's hope everything's fine. So he was definitely a nice man in that sense, made a good impression, but he was not a leader. The country was heading an enormous crisis that was obvious that was going on. And in that crisis, he was not, he didn't rise to the occasion. So he was this interim candidate who had this possibility, but he didn't rise to the occasion. He also was entirely boring. He laughed all the time, smiled all the time, but when he read his speeches, you would fall asleep before they started. So he was, in a way, you can kind of put it into the context of the whole development. This is the development that has many, many problems, and one of them is, of course, the leader. Until today, it's a little bit of a mystery why people went around and cried, shouted out, "Long live Dubček," and so on. That would be an interesting discussion, how that was possible, despite what he was. But definitely, I think many people agree and that he was not a man for these tough moments to come. So that is there, and that is reasserted at the end when Dubček is juxtaposed next to Žižka and Saint Wenceslas. This is a little bit funny, I must say, at the end. So the documentary followed a certain set of cliches, I would say patriotic cliches, definitely, because it starts at in the castle area. It starts, so these are these kind of mythological places, and ends there as well. But that was not, I think that was not entirely off the mark, because the reaction of the population was to some sense patriotic. Mm-hmm. So I think that at that moment when the invasion came and so on, there was a certain patriotism among people, and people understood this as not as an invasion against the Communist Party, but an invasion against us.
So let me ask you about some of the groups that we see represented in the film, and almost like a sort of anthropology of different Czech communities, right? And I think, at least for me, it seemed to me that the filmmaker was trying to tell us there was a lot of this was already like this pressure valve was a little bit loose, right? And so a lot of different communities were already sort of starting to present their own visions of cultural identity, right? And their own visions of maybe a sort of future for Czech society. So we have the hippies, the folks in the national costume, right? Jewish Prague, right? Religious Prague. And it seemed, and then we also learned that months before the invasion, there were already these political meetings and discussions happening in Wenceslas Square. So that so that it's not that overnight the tanks come and suddenly there is this spontaneous protest. Actually, this was a long time coming. There were already these people. You and I talked before. I don't know where the mic is. Oh yeah, you and I talked just a couple of days ago about the declining economy, right? That also drove people to protest where maybe they wouldn't have, before, when the GDP wasn't declining, when wages weren't declining. So it seems like that there was that buildup, right? And my question is, where do you position yourself among these groups, right? Where do we find you a student in Prague.
I'm
What was
sorry
your
to
experience?
disappoint you. I positioned myself among those who decided to leave as soon as possible. So, because my kind of attitude was, I thought it was everything very naive and unsustainable, what was happening, and the result was predictable in some sense. The only problem is that you don't know when the disaster comes, whether it's on Monday or Tuesday, but you know it will come. It's close. So, you know, the film was, I wonder what the original script was and what the original ending was meant to be. But you are right, and in kind of noting that there is this variety, there is this plurality, there is this, it's a kind of panoramic, these sections are a kind of panorama. And while I think that I'm not kind of excited about sections with Dubček, I definitely think, because they were the cliches of the time, I think that the concept was actually correct and reflected the spirit of these reforms. Namely, that's a little bit complicated. In 1960, Czechoslovakia declared itself a socialist republic. So first it was a dictatorship of the proletariat, then they switched to the people's democracy, and then they decided they were a socialist society. And the socialist society meant, which was not just a terminology, that was scientifically kind of disestablished. That meant that the ways and means of the 50s are no longer necessary. The Communist Party was victorious, it won. And now it was a time to switch from this simplistic revolutionary structure of the society, namely workers, peasants, working intelligentsia, and especially put back this whole notion of class struggle and go to a stage when the state, when the Communist Party recognizes the existence of is able to see that that society is actually very has many facets, and there are many interest groups that have for no reasons been suppressed. And so part of this democratization process or reform process was to simply go away from class struggle and say, well, but we also have young people and old people, we have men and women, we have students, we have we have peasants, we have all sorts of interest groups, and they deserve to be treated individually. They deserve to be granted their specifics and all these things. So in those days, all of a sudden, these barachnici that were there with the flags, or Sokol, the gymnastic organization, they were popping up from the darkness that they were put into, and that was somehow actually the program, the reform program, or the program of the Reform Communist Party sanctioned that. The program said that we now have no longer the need to use these measures of the 50s. We can pay attention to the needs and interests of individual groups. And all of a sudden, there was an enormous range of individual groups. And among them was, for instance, a group, association of political prisoners. political prisoners who were released. There was another group that called itself a club of engaged non-party members. Had the Prague Spring lasted 2-3 months more, these would be new political parties, basically. And so the logical, because like, let's say April, May, June, going to the Ministry of the Interior with a permission to establish a new political party would be, they would pick you up, they would lock you up immediately. So even then, so that was not possible. But had this been going on, there would have been new political parties coming out of this plurality. Mm-hmm. And had it lasted yet another 2 months, there would have been demands for free elections and so on. So that had to be stopped. So from the point of view of Moscow and also East Germany, for instance, East German leadership was very worried about what's going on right next to them. So the intervention, so they did not succeed in negotiating a kind of slowdown or reversal. So that was their kind of, that was the problem. A normal situation would be normal. A situation would be that they would organize a putsch, a coup d'etat. One day they would come with tanks, the other day there would be a new government of a new puppet government. That did not happen. So politically, the solution was not in sight, and politically, and so the extreme ultimate measure was taken, and that was this invasion, which, if you think about that, was logistically an enormously complicated and demanding thing, that they had not done anything like that before, like flying tanks into Prague.
500,000
many tanks
soldiers
were flown in. So there were transport machines landing in Ruzyně, and tanks were rolling out of them. So this was an extreme measure. And my take on this is that everything has several kind of levels and several kind of causes. And I think that it was not only the suppression of this, or control or containment of this development, but that there was also a demand, at least on the part of the Soviet General Staff, to have the Soviet army permanently stationed in Czechoslovakia, because these tanks didn't go away. Some of them did, but basically immediately there were new Soviet military bases were established. So I think on the side of this military thinking, this was a kind of success. The tanks, but of course the tanks were, you know, when we were there in the city, the city full of tanks, it was an enormous, there is an enormous pressure, of course. There is an enormous, they don't shoot. I think they had in general an instruction not to shoot. But it's, and of course, in some cases they did, but in general, it was enough to drive them around the city. You know, it was an enormously powerful statement. So that was the atmosphere of those days.
I want to ask for questions from the audience, and maybe even questions from Zoom, since we're now at 8:35. Anybody has questions for Professor Toman? Just please in the back.
I have a simple question about the script. In the documentary, you see the messages being written out in the Cyrillic script, and it is no longer used in like the Czech Republic, and I believe in Slovakia.
It was never used. The reaction of the population, since these tanks did not really, this was not Hungary in 1956,
But why Cyrillic?
when everyone was kind of lying flat on the floor, on the ground. But the population, that was the reason why population could do, you saw tanks among people. People were close to tanks on sidewalks, etc., etc. And people set up posters in Russian for the Russian invaders. So that was, these posters, these messages were not for Czechs. They were they had to kind of subvert the morale of the invaders. And mostly, you see the shots of the soldiers there. I must say that I don't remember them that way. I once, I was at a sidewalk, and I raised my fist when a truck with soldiers was passing by, and you know what happened? They started laughing. They laughed me out. It was pure arrogance of power. They were just, give me a break. Someone's raising fist. They were like, it was fun for them. So I think there is this also, I think, a myth of surprised, exploited, misled Soviet soldiers who were, some indeed were kind of surprised. Some might have been kind of influenced, but at the same time, this was an enormous Soviet army, and they, you know, I don't think that they took much, you know, they were there. That was it, and so this was the yes. There was another question.
Yeah, you said that you think that just the act of the tanks rolling through the city was kind of effective enough without the shooting, and that the soldiers were kind of arrogant. Do you think that that has any kind of interconnectedness with the fact that they had been invaded just 30 years earlier and with World War II? Like, do you think that there was any intersection there?
I didn't understand the end of the question.
Do you think that there was an intersection between the country having been invaded just 30 years earlier by Germany,
Yeah.
and their willingness to be, not willingness, but the lack of pushback against the tanks? Like, the tanks didn't need to shoot, they just rolled through the city, and that was effective enough. Do you think that that's connected to?
I don't know. I think the two situations were very different. The German invasion in March 1939 was a totally different ballgame. I would say that you know, that was war. That was Czechoslovakia stopped existing. Czechoslovakia, the western part, became a protectorate of Germany. This was serious occupation in some sense. Later in the Czech situation, some people said this was not occupation because politically they were there anyway. So, but I think that it was an occupation. The presence of the army was very important, especially in this coda of the Prague Spring. The Prague Spring had an absurd coda, so to speak. It lasted almost longer after August 21, after it was crushed. the final changes happened in April 1969. So 7-8 months after it, the leadership was taken to Moscow. No new leadership could be kind of stamped out of the ground. The leadership signed certain documents, treaties and so on, and returned. And it was in its position until April 1969, for several months. So it was a strange situation. Of course, during that time, the troops were there, and a treaty was conducted about permanent positioning, stationing. And I think in the spring of '69, one of the Soviet marshals came to Prague and reminded the leadership that we are here, that we need to be taken seriously, which was a political pressure. Of course, that was an act of political pressure.
Let's take maybe one question from
Yeah.
Zoom before we
Yeah.
go.
Well,
Before we
so-
go to you.
So yeah, so I have I'm phoning in with a question from Professor Herbert Eagle, who has taught film at this university for many years, and he sent in this question over Zoom, mentioning that in 1968, when the Czech novelist Ivan Klima visited Ann Arbor, in the wake of the Soviet invasion, his prediction was that the Soviet invasion would be insufficient to stamp out the reform movement that was already underway, which had in large part precipitated the invasion to begin with. And what Professor Eagle is asking is whether that sentiment that, oh, our reform movement is too strong to be suppressed by a Soviet tank invasion, and then the infantry, was that a general feeling around Prague that no, we'll continue on, Soviets or no Soviets?
Well, some people may have thought that. I would say that was a pure illusion, because I'm not a political scholar, and I don't have any, and I cannot offer any analysis. In some sense, at the beginning, the invasion was a disaster, because there was no new government, there was no new Communist Party leadership. The Politburo came back from Moscow and was continued to be the Politburo. So in that sense, maybe from the Soviet point of view, this was not a great political success, because there was this period until April '69, until everything got under control. But I would bet that if we had access to the right materials, there was a lot behind the scenes kind of negotiations, events, pressure, that resulted in Dubček being deposed in April. So so yes, this is kind of half true, half incorrect. Some people saw immediately, well, let's get out of here, because this will not work, and this is just. And some people, seeing no grand violence of the type like, I don't know, Berlin '53, or even Poznan '56, or Budapest '56, they thought there was this kind of idea that it's no longer 1956. Times have improved. We are kind of, but yes, maybe they have improved, but the results were achieved eventually. So this Communist Party leadership was removed, and the Communist Party leadership, of course, was living in a world of illusions in and of itself, because the whole reform movement was based on the premise that there will be a reform of the Communist Party, and that the Communist Party is there forever. So, for instance, I had this famous professor, Goldstecker was my professor at the university, and he was, he spent several years in prison. After he was released, he needed a major dental work to make his missing teeth repaired. And his position was this: if young people, so there was a discussion by young people, if young people have doubts, that's good. If they don't agree about everything, that's good. This is a healthy development. This shows that people are active and so on. So what they should do is they should join the Communist Party. They should join the Communist Party as the exclusive platform where these doubts will be resolved, will be discussed and resolved. And that's what they should do. There was no talk at any moment actually about any political pluralism. There was a talk about paying attention to women's interests or to Jewish interests or those interests, etc. So these interest groups were kind of now recognized, but there was never any talk about political pluralism. The Communist Party seemed to be eternal, and although there is a program of the Communist Party from April 1968, reform program, and that starts with a statement: we are our society is in a state of a deep crisis. So somehow they knew it. But the standing premise and was that, all these politicians that you saw there, whom you saw in the film, you could ask, of course, how come they were there? How come, were they elected by anyone? What was the idea? Well, the idea was that it's the Communist Party that runs the show, basically. And that was an enormous illusion on the part of in my interpretation, that was an enormous illusion on the part of the reformers. Because whether they believed this, some of the reformers did not believe that. They joined in for pragmatic reasons, kind of gradually. Some, like my professor, believed it religiously, I would say. And I think that was a project that was doomed to a disaster for a number of reasons. Internally, conceptually, there was no way that it could be executed, and then for external reasons, of course, that it was a bad example, and it was not. And after it could not be contained, it had to be kind of militarily suppressed.
Let's go to your question.
Right. Hi, Professor Tolman. Thank you for being with us tonight. My question kind of echoes back to your previous comment about Dubček's unfitness for the job, and just the leadership of Czechoslovakia back then in general. So alongside Dubček, what's his name? Svoboda. He was the president, right, at the period. So, and I know that he is a veteran. He served in the military during both world wars, and he was the president. So I would have assumed that Svoboda would have been a person with the legal power and the leadership to make something
No,
happen. So
no.
I'm just wondering, like, what kind of role this would have played, or what kind of role could he have played?
He definitely had a history from. He was the general of the Czechoslovak unit in the Soviet Union during World War. So he was a general. He was a soldier. His position was, he was a diplomat. He was, if not opportunist, basically. He tried always to kind of swim somehow between potential disasters. And he became president as a relatively old man when he really didn't have much power. The system did not work that way. The system simply, the power was not in the hands of the president. This was not a presidential system. This was not even symbolically a presidential system. People kind of liked him because he was this he had, his CV was brushed up quite considerably, and what we saw was kind of positive. But he became president also after the former party secretary, who was also a president, who happened to be a president. It was the accumulation of functions. Stepped back as president in March, I think March 68. So Svoboda stepped in only very recently before that. And I think that at one point at some point that would be a very, see, I, as a witness, I cannot tell you much about that because this was really political history, diplomatic history. Part of the diplomatic history is in the film when Ceausescu comes to Prague. I don't know why they did not mention his name. They didn't dare to say that, but it was Ceausescu. And I think also Tito came before him. So that shows that there was some attempts to establish kind of support independent line. Not everything is Moscow. We have allies elsewhere. They come symbolically, visit us, and so on. And Ceausescu and Tito were, I don't know whether this was still very effective, but they were representatives actually of a movement of non-allied countries that existed for a while. That was Yugoslavia, Egypt, India, and I think to some extent Ceausescu as well, because he was not so Moscow oriented, although it was a communist country, of course. So the selection was quite good, actually, bringing Tito, bringing Ceausescu, and it was an attempt to, it was diplomatically, I think, a kind of clever idea. So this diplomacy was not entirely dead, but of course it had no effect.
Let's do another Zoom question
Yeah.
if we have any.
One more. Yeah.
One more.
Oh. Okay, there's a question. Back there.
Question from the audience.
Yes, I am wondering, of course, the documentary showed what they could film at the time and what was happening on the streets, what was happening outside of that. We don't see only through literature, movies like Unbearable Lightness of Being also showed this, and also showed the face of intellectuals that were kind of demoted to different situations of immigration. But I'm curious about to what extent this episode of Prague Spring or Czech Spring contributed to Velvet Revolution later. Because basically, was there any kind of opposition politically against communists?
Well, that's a difficult question. That's the Velvet Spring is very kind of dependent on perestroika and what happened in Moscow. So if you want a simplification, first you had Berlin 53, then you had Poland 56, then you had so everything was kind of moving around, and finally you had perestroika in Moscow. So that changed the whole configuration. I don't think this is, I didn't live there anymore, and it's hard for me, I can only speculate, but I would say that there was very little recourse to the Prague Spring but I might be wrong, in Velvet Revolution. Because Prague Spring was a kind of an impossible construction. Prague Spring was a program to reform the Communist Party. And what were the reforms? What were why was it socialism with human face? Well, if you read the program of the Communist Party, all these points. So for instance, there is a point, justice will be independent. The courts, so this was a reform point, part of the reform. Courts will be independent. There will be censorship is illegal, and one point after another. So there was, I would say, there was really very little specifically socialist or communist in the program. These were what was the human face of socialism consisted in introducing democracy. And the illusion was, or at least maybe forced illusion on the part of the Communist Party, was that the Communist Party will be somehow, it will be all under the auspices of the Communist Party, and everything will go on kind of, that was, in my opinion, and that was one of the reasons why I thought it was, let's get out of here, because this is all nonsense. This can only generate new repression. So but not many people thought that way. So the documentary is interesting. By the way, talking about documentaries, what I really saw firsthand was not political things like in the Politburo and things like that. What I saw firsthand was the change in the public sphere, media, journalism, TV. That was immensely important. And there were, I would say until today, sensational documentaries on TV that were, this was kind of, yeah, the society has a range, okay, that's good. And but there was what we would call investigative journalism, TV journalism. For instance, those who are interested in Czech film, there is much beyond that, beyond Czech film. There are documentaries on TV that were shown in already like 66, 67, 68. There was a very interesting program called Zvědavá kamera, Curious Camera. They were mentioned there actually. They would go into prisons, or they would try to reconstruct political trials and things like that. Otka Bednářová was Otka Bednářová was one of the outstanding journalists who was conducting these, who was putting together these documentaries. And they were tough documentaries. They were confrontational. They would manage to find former prison guards. They would manage to find victims, confront victims with prison guards, for instance, and things like that. So, and also filmically, I think they were very, I think it was a golden time of investigative film, journalism, TV that was enormous, and they were watched by millions. They were watched by millions, and it was quite clear who they are for and what they are about. So this documentary, in comparison, is a fragment, and it's very hard to say what the script was meant to be by the end. Had that not been this invasion section.
Thank you so much, everyone.
All right. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you,
Okay,
everybody.
sorry,
Thank you, Chris, for hosting it and for doing all this technical support. And I hope people enjoyed it. And it was certainly interesting. And I think at the last end of your very interesting story about the journalism and TV, hopefully this were preserved in some archives and this can be studied.
It is, for instance, the Zereva camera shows are on YouTube. You can go on, you can watch them on, or maybe the Czech TV archive section or something like that. It's stunning to see them after. This, I think, was not stunning. They are stunning. These, yeah, sorry.
All right, so thank you, Professor Thoman and Professor
Thank you.
Eisman.